and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen, and tonight we're continuing our conversation about media and communication in the city of Boston. It's an opportunity for us to hear from and to talk about issues to do with media and communication, of which is a very wide and exciting theoretical area, but also the practicalities of how media is operated and operating in this area, the city, the structure of relations, if you like, both economic and social, all of which are of interest to us and concern us in this program. So I'm delighted tonight to welcome Maria Balinska from The Conversation.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, Maria. You're based at Boston University.
We are.
The Conversation, and I suppose the important point to make is that your interest is in journalism, and journalism, I suppose, is seen as the very practical side of media theory. And so we'll get to talk a little bit about the activities of The Conversation and your career in journalism, and particularly how something like The Conversation, which we'll hear about, maybe connects with the history of journalism in Boston or with other media in Boston and in the United States. So I guess the first thing is to hear from you about what The Conversation actually is.
Well, thank you, and I'm really pleased to be with you this evening. The Conversation is I would say, a meeting of two worlds. It brings together journalism and scholarship and academics. And it really it came about because of, it came about in 2011 in Australia as a result of our founder, Andrew Jaspin, who had been the editor of many newspapers, including the Melbourne Age in Australia and the Observer in the UK, spending a year at the University of Melbourne, where he was contemplating the lack of explanatory journalism in mainstream media, explanatory journalism that would be produced by people who had deep knowledge of their area. And he was coming into, he was encountering on the part of academics a frustration with journalists, that journalists often got the wrong end of the stick on their research, that they were often misquoted. And the idea that he came up with was a very simple one, which was basically bringing these two worlds together, that you would have the news sense and communication skills of the journalist and the expertise and in-depth knowledge of the academic. And so what I like to think about of it as is a newsroom where you have the editors are journalists and all the reporters are academics.
Okay. Well, it sounds good to me from the very start of the foundation, because I'm a Melbourne boy, as we say in Melbourne, although I've lived in the United States for a long time. I'm going to be somewhat deferential to anything that comes out of Melbourne. That probably makes me weak or something, but I think we all have a kind of a default to an interest in our hometown activities. And Melbourne, of course, is a big university city. But the connection between this kind of journalism and the academy seems to me to be quite unusual, at least in Australia, and then the export of this model to the United States. Would you like to talk about how something that starts in Australia becomes established in the United States?
Well, I should say there's also a step along the way, because first of all, out of this idea came a news and analysis and commentary producer, The Conversation, that did extremely well in Australia, found a lot of readers and found a lot of contributors. This then, 2 years later, was replicated in the United Kingdom. So we have The Conversation UK, based in London, at City University London. And out of this then, two successful models. Andrew came to the United States and persuaded 6 foundations, the Sloan Foundation, Hewlett, Robert Wood Johnson, Howard Hughes, Gates, and Gordon and Betty Moore, to provide funding to do this in the United States. So obviously he could point to something that was both a unique model and working in 2 other countries. The Boston came into the equation because the dean of Boston University's College of Communication, Tom Fiedler, offered the conversation housing on campus.
Right.
So that's how we came to be in Boston, because of the support of Tom and BU.
Right.
And so we launched in October 2014. We've been around now for 7 months.
Right. So the connection between Boston University and the conversation is really the result of a clear and direct decision on the part of the executive there, Tom Fiedler, to invite the conversation to be part of the city. It must seem sensible in some ways to have the conversation in a city that has so many universities and such a high reputation globally for its knowledge production. Would that be fair?
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, there's no question that there's a huge value in being in Boston because of the nexus of different universities. I mean, we've had, it's fair to say, we've had contributions from almost all universities, and Boston College, Boston University, Harvard, MIT, Suffolk Law School, Bentley, Wellesley, Tufts, it's Emerson. It's very rich and varied. And so it's a wonderful jumping off point. But I also want to stress that one of the things that we're doing at the conversation is really reaching out to universities across the country, because we believe that given the United States is such a varied and place geographically and socially, economically, we really want that diversity of perspective to also be reflected in the range of contributors and contributing universities on the site.
Right. Now, my understanding of the conversation, and I've watched it since its inception way back in the day, is it really provides a translation of academic work by academics, and then there's a kind of gatekeeping process where journalists then take over the work, or at least work with the academic to make it readable. So I wanted to talk about the journalistic aspect of it first. You've been a journalist for your entire career, has been in journalism, so can you tell us a bit about where you came from, and perhaps then the appeal of this kind of work and this kind of transformation in journalism, and certainly the publication of academic work into the public domain?
So I spent the bulk of my career at the BBC in London in radio, and mostly in reporting international affairs. But I was, and this is relevant to the conversation, about the conversation, I spent most of that career in the current affairs department of the BBC, where our remit was to complement the daily news agenda with in-depth original journalism. And my last 10 years at the BBC, I was running the World Current Affairs radio department and producing content for 5 different radio networks within the United Kingdom, and then the BBC World Service. So that made me very sensitive, of course, to audience and what plays with different audiences. But as a result of looking for that, original perspective and content, we also worked with a number of academics. I worked with a number of academics on documentary series, and debate shows, and in the most difficult format for radio, and to my mind, that there is, which is the radio talk, sort of the 8 to 10 minutes essay, but written to be read, and therefore written to really, keep an audience's attention. I mean, the equivalent here, it's telling a story, but how do you do that with also, communicating content and argument and ideas at the same time? So, in terms of, then I then came to the United States on a Nieman Fellowship to Harvard, and during that time decided I would try my hand at my own startup, and looking at experimenting in international affairs and how can one cover them differently for domestic audiences. And what interested me was sort of exploding the notion of foreign affairs coverage being only out there and not so connected to us here, and looking at the links and parallels between the rest of the world and American lives.
Right. Okay.
And that I did that for a few years, and that was a bit of a pilot. And then when the funding ran out for that, and I was very lucky that that was the time when the conversation was looking to establish itself. And so the conversation appealed to me for a number of different reasons. One is because the kind of journalism that I did was very much about exploring new ideas, explaining context, being counterintuitive. In other words, you know, we all assume one thing about a certain story. Well, actually, you start to do, you know, you do the research, you get to the person who's done a lot of thinking or research or scholarship on a given topic, and actually you realize the story is quite a different one. So I was always looking for that kind of explanatory journalism, knowledge-based journalism that would help BBC listeners make sense of the world around them.
Right.
Well, I think that's exactly what the conversation is trying to do, you know, because it's precisely with working with academics who have spent their lives looking at particular topics and you know, building understanding around them. If we unlock or translate, as you say, that thinking to a wide audience, it can prove, you know, extremely. I mean, it's a huge benefit and value, particularly in a, you know, democracy where we need this kind of information to make decisions about our daily lives, but also, you know, when we are partaking in policy decisions or making or decide or voting for people or voting for particular policies on referendum, for example.
Right.
So you know, this is where academics. I think that this notion that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, that you bring the journalist and the academic together, that together they can create something that is actually new in the media marketplace.
Well, that's a significant contribution if it proves to be the case. So let's call that the theory of the conversation.
Okay.
But I'm sure there's a significant element of truth to it. And the thought that comes to mind when you're describing the conversation is that old trope, I guess, of the gown and town connection.
Yes.
Connecting the academics with the city in which they live. And there's enough academics in Boston to be well and truly connected with the city, but also, as you say, nationally, and to contribute to the larger discussion, maybe even the debate. Because the irony, of course, and we should talk about this aspect of the conversation now, the irony is that the conversation really exists because of the internet, because of the network. And it's available freely. All the content, as far as I know, is available freely just by a click on the conversation and then by scrolling through the headlines and the various topic areas. Is that correct?
Well, even more than that, you know, it's available anyone freely to read online, but actually it's also available for any other publication to republish.
Oh, right. Okay.
And, you know, we publish everything under a Creative Commons license.
Right.
And the whole idea, the ethos behind that is that this is information analysis and commentary that is of public value. It's of public interest. And therefore it should be spread and read and shared as widely as possible. And so we're now in the United States regularly republished by Quartz, the Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Post, Newsweek, Time, Fortune, IFL Science, and so on and so forth. And, you know, this we see is very much, you know, we're a non-for-profit, and this is very much part of our it's part of our package, but it's also very much part of our value to readers, but also to contributors.
Right. Yes. Well, as I say in the business world, the value proposition here is pretty clear, and of course, the value proposition, if you like, for me, and something which excites me, is this notion of the public interest. That the great claims that American democracy makes is that the media offers a vehicle for the public to know what's going on, Sometimes that's referred to as transparency. And that information and the circulation of that information then allows the public to be better informed. Now, in media studies in particular, we know better than that now. We know that there's many distractions. However, I think the model that the conversation offers is that the internet makes a very different calculation possible with the way information circulates from the university, where it's previously been captured, as it were, and restricted to a few journals that we're published in, or that I publish in, let's say, and the few dozen people who might read them, to a fully archived database of an amazing range of stories. So it's really changed the landscape of journalism, I think, hasn't it?
You mean the conversation itself?
Well, the conversation, but the internet as well.
Oh, the internet, no question, has changed the landscape of journalism. I mean, from the very way that one researches a story. When I started at the BBC, we used to go get clippings on paper, and that's how we did our research, right? But also to the way one communicates with one's listeners or readers or audiences, or that's also very important, because there is literally a conversation going on. And then the dissemination of this information. And the fact that, for example, a number of our articles turn out to be extremely popular in India.
Okay.
There is a
Who would have known?
There's a news aggregator in India that likes a lot of what we publish, and so we know that we have a lot of readers in India.
Right. Is there a position or an orientation, politically or otherwise, of the conversation?
No, not at all. No, not at all. I mean, there's absolutely, I think this is one of the points about it, that we are, we're non-for-profit. We're not taking any, we don't have advertising. We're independent, and we're making an effort to reflect the variety of perspectives that are in academia. So we are limited to some extent by the variety of perspectives that exist in academia, right? But we have had people, we've had some people, everybody who contributes to the conversation has to fill out a disclosure form, which will say if he or she's had funding for research that's relevant to the article, or if he or she is affiliated with an organization or a political party that might be relevant. Well, we've had both registered Democrats and registered Republicans who have contributed. Right.
And it doesn't frighten them off to have to admit?
Have to say that?
Right.
I think, no, it on the whole it hasn't. I mean, our argument is this. Look, we think if it's relevant, of course, in some cases it's completely irrelevant that they are a registered Republican or Democrat. Yeah. But when it's relevant, we say to them, we think this strengthens your standing because you're being absolutely open and transparent about where you're coming from. And the point is that we're not doing op-eds. We're doing, we're putting out articles that are, they can have strong opinions, they can make strong arguments, but they're backed by evidence.
Well, it's very, very much a research focus, isn't it? Yes. And I think it's very appealing in the sense in which the knowledge that, as I said earlier, has been previously locked up in the universities is being emancipated, as it were, and the internet is making it possible. Let's just talk a little bit, if we can, about the structure. And so the system here in the United States is that the funding for the conversation comes from foundations. Is that correct?
Right now.
Right.
Right now, for the pilot phase of the conversation, the sustainability of the conversation in the UK and Australia is based on university membership, and that is the plan for the United States.
Oh, okay.
Well. Yes.
All right. So Boston College, where I work, could expect a knock on the door and a cap in hand asking for some sort of subscription.
Well, or what we hope is that Boston College comes to the conversation and says, look, this is fantastic what you're doing. This is a platform for public scholarship that we believe to be important at a time when universities are increasingly thinking about how to engage the public more. And we'd like to be part of it.
Well, that's a wonderful way of putting it. No, I have no influence at Boston College, but I think what's important to understand is the principle that you're talking about, which is the role of this, the knowledge and its contribution to public discourse. That's a very important point for how media theory has been developed over the years, stretching back, I suppose, not that long ago to Jürgen Habermas and the German social traditions of understanding that the richer a democracy, the more voices there will be. And it seems to me that the conversation is part of that, some of that model at least. What about the background, or what's I think in IT is referred to as the back end, or the behind the scenes? What happens in behind the scenes? You've got your funding. Who's making it all possible for what readers then see on the screen?
Well, at the very heart of it is a wonderful content management system that was developed in Australia. So it's not an off-the-shelf system. It was developed for the conversation. And one of the wonderful things about that, there are a number of wonderful things about that, but to begin with, in terms of when actually editing an article, the contributor, the way that it allows for a very user-friendly interface for the editor and contributor to work together on editing the piece. And I personally find that the Microsoft Word way of tracking changes in an article is very off-putting. It looks like somebody's come along with a big red pencil and strikes things out, and you feel a little. I find when I get something back like that, I feel a little affronted. This system, one of the aspects of this system is that you can make changes. You make suggested changes. Every change is kept, and there's a history that you can look back. Okay. Nothing is lost, but what the person who is looking at the latest edition of the article sees is simply a clean copy.
Okay.
So that's so that's very. I think that's very attractive. Another thing that's very attractive is that every author can see, once the article is published, how many people have read it, where they've read it, so what countries they've read it in. When it's republished by, let's say, Quartz or Slate or whatever, they see the names of the publications that have republished, how many people have come to that publication. They see all the tweets, they see the Facebook comments, and they see all the comments, all on one page. That's another thing that's fantastic. The third thing that I'll highlight is that we have these, now we have 4 editions, because on top of Australia, UK, US, we now have Africa, which is just a couple of weeks old, based in Johannesburg, but for all of Africa, which is wonderful. And I can take a story, if there's a story, let's say there's a story, very interesting story today on the African site about why American college students should spend a year in Africa studying. So I can take that site, I can just pull that article over from the Africa site and put it on my site very easily. So these are, it's been designed so that it can really enable a global conversation. And that comes back to, I was talking about how my interest is in, has always been in international affairs and at the links and parallels between countries. So this is yet another aspect of the conversation that has appealed to me personally, is this notion that you can bring together academics from different countries to have them looking at, issues that are affecting us all, and to compare and contrast the research that's taking place in different countries.
And have you seen any influence, or is there any indication that some of the journalism, or maybe we need a different term for it, but some of the articles and the knowledge and the research reports that have appeared in the conversation have been taken up, let's say, by policymakers or by people elsewhere? Do you track that sort of thing?
Well, I'm sure that there are some. Here in the United States, I can't think of anything yet that has had that kind of impact. Although I would say that a number of our contributors have been asked subsequently to appear on talk shows, Good Morning America, with their research. So, I think that certainly there's been, I've had this sense of people's research being talked about. The sort of following the dotted line to the policymakers, I can't give you an example right now, but I know that is the case in Australia.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not a very fair question to ask. But I think what might be fascinating, particularly for researchers who are interested in understanding the conversation, is to think about the media richness of the environment. That while traditional newspapers have looked at one source of publicity, that is, there are the words on the page, and even the internet tends to operate the same way. Well, you know, I've got a blog, here's my blog, and here's the 100 or 1,000 words or whatever it is. In your case, what I hear you talking about is a very rich environment where the material moves very quickly and is shifting across different formats and different genres, if you like, and different styles of social media from the conversation. And I think that suggests some significant change in the way that the knowledge and the information is circulating.
And there is, you see, it's interesting because there's been a lot of talk in media circles that everything needs to be niche, right? That, you know, you go to a very narrow interest in order to build out something new.
Yeah.
And the conversation goes at it completely differently. It says, actually, you know, we have desks from arts and culture to politics and society to science and technology. The common denominator is that all of these articles are written by academics.
Yes, yes.
And I think that there's I think what we're showing is there is strength in having these things together and having a platform together. And I have thought of one way in which we have made an impact, which is that actually Bill Gates has retweeted some of our content. So, you know, and of course it was around international public health.
Right.
But, you know, this shows that we are sort of some of our content is getting through to people who have the ability to make big decisions.
Well, Maria, thank you very much. I guess we can leave on a high note with knowing that Mr. Gates is reading the conversation, and I want to thank you for your contribution and for speaking to us tonight. So that's it. Good night, and that's all from Boston Media Theory. Until next time, this is Marcus Breen. See you later.